Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. And the other day I got asked a pretty interesting question from a student of mine, and that was, do I really need to know botany to be a good herbalist? And I thought this was a very curious question, and it's led to other questions of mine where we have all of these other kind of branches of study associated with plants that may or may not actually contribute to you being a really good herbalist. So I thought it was an interesting question that I would share with everybody in the evolutionary herbalism community. So let's talk about this. But for starters, let's talk about botany. What exactly is botany? Well, the way I tend to think of botany is that it is essentially it's a branch of science. And I think of botany as basically a language. It is a scientifically based language used for describing plants in sometimes painstakingly detail, right? We're looking at their physiology, their anatomical structures, we're looking at their ecology, their distribution. And in a big way, we're looking at how plants are classified. We're looking at an organizational structure in which plants are put into specific categories based on patterns and similarities in typically their anatomical and physiological structures. So it's a language that we use to describe plants. And like any language and learning a new language, it can be complicated, right? It can be take a lot of focus and a lot of work and a lot of discipline to really learn the botany language in a lot of detail. And one of the ways I like to think of botany as it applies to herbalism, because right, botany is a whole branch of science. It doesn't always all pertain necessarily directly to herbal medicine, but I think there's a handful of attributes of botany that do, and that I think can be really good to know and to understand, and some of which I think is essential. So let's talk about some of these layers of botany. So first and foremost, we have basically the morphological descriptions and identification characteristics of plants. This is basically how do you properly identify a plant? How do you describe a plant in a way that is very accurate and very detailed and very specific, sometimes to a point where you got to look at it under a microscope or at the very least a little handheld loop in order to identify some of those characteristics. If you've ever opened up a field guide or a plant ID book, you might find yourself having a really difficult time even understanding, what they're talking about. Like, leaf margins are serrated and it's glabrous, and the petiole is of the inflorescence, and like all these really, really big words. And it's like, what is this, right? That's all botanical language. We might look at something and say, oh, it's a stem. Well, the stem attached to a flower has a different name than a stem attached to a leaf. So there's all kinds of details and nuances to how plants are described. And this can be very tedious to learn, but what it does is it empowers you with the ability to describe that plant in detail, to look at a plant in real life in comparison to a botanical description of that plant, and to be able to determine if, what you're looking at is the plant that you think that you're actually looking at, right? So this is a big part of botany, playing a big part in plant identification, which of course comes in a big way in your wildcrafting, even identifying plants that you're maybe ordering from a company to prepare into a medicine. It's always good to double check these things because adulteration does occur. It is, not super common, but it does occur. And so you always want to make sure you're properly identifying the plants that you're working with. And in order to do that, you generally need to know a little bit of botany. Now, another layer of botany that I think is very, very important for herbalists is our naming conventions and, the nomenclature that we use for herbs. Specifically, what we refer to as the Latin binomials of plants. So generally, when we're thinking of the name of a plant, you've got your common names and your Latin names. And common names are notoriously unreliable, right? There are many herbs that sometimes have the same common name. There are herbs that have many different common names, and someone might say, oh, use lion's foot, and someone has never heard that before, and then they're like, oh, it's also known as this, and you're referring to different plants. So the thing about the botanical nomenclature of plants is that it's very, very specific in terms of the species, the genus and the species. And in botany, you kind of have these big layers of organization of, the flowering plants and the non-flowering plants. And then, you have these different categories that slowly get more and more specific. And what I find as herbalists, I think the three layers that are really important to know are your families, your genera, and your genus and your species. This is very, very helpful. Families are really helpful to know because you can start to recognize patterns in not only the morphology of the plants, their shape, their structure, etc., but also in medicinal properties. It's shocking how many plants that share a family, that there's a lot of overlap in their medicinal virtues. A good example of this would be something like the Lamiaceae, the mint family, right? These are indicated commonly by squared off stems, opposite leaves, and a very distinct aromatic nature. Well, the Lamiaceae family is full of aromatic plants that are carminative for the digestive system. The Rosaceae, right? Very commonly we find herbs that are sour tasting, cooling and sedative to excessive heat and irritation and inflammation and oxidation. The Apiaceae family. This is an important family to recognize because, the Apiaceae, we've got a lot of food plants, right? Like your carrots. You've got lots of wild foods. You also have lots of medicinal plants, your angelica, your osha, your lomatium, lots of medicinals there. You also have some of your kill you dead toxic plants in the Apiaceae. So being able to recognize those patterns are really, really important. And knowing your plant families is very, very useful. It also helps you kind of start to assess maybe a plant that you don't know. Just being able to recognize it, the family patterns can really start to lead you down potentially closer into understanding the medicinal virtue of that plant. So it's useful to know. And that's originally how I actually studied herbs, was based on their families. When I was at Bastyr University, that was our main organizational structure for studying plants. It wasn't by organ system, it wasn't by action, it wasn't by what they're good for. It was based on plant families. So it is a useful way of studying plants. Now, the Latin binomial, your genus and species, is essential. You have to know the Latin names of your plants because it's the only way that you really know what plant you're talking about, especially when you're discussing it with another person. Again, this is because common names are vast. They are different from place to place. But as soon as you drop a Latin name, you're on the same page. And I think this is one of the bigger contributions that botany has made in terms of kind of standardizing the naming conventions so that we just all really know exactly what herb you're talking about. So do you need to know it though, right? That's the big question. Do you really need to know botany to be a great practicing herbalist? So if we're thinking about a clinical herbalist, right? That your job, your work with plants is sitting down with the person, figuring out what's going on with their health, and administering herbal remedies to them. Do you need to know botany to do that? No, I would say no. You don't necessarily need to know a whole lot of in-depth botany to be an effective clinical or practicing herbalist. I would say the one aspect of botany you definitely do need to know is the Latin names. That is just central. You have to know the name of the plant that you're working with. But aside from that, botany doesn't really have a major influence necessarily on the actual clinical practice of herbal medicine, right? When we're just kind of zooming in on the aspect of working with clients and administering remedies. Of course, there's a lot that you need to know about the herbs and about people and about therapeutics and all of that, but that's all separate areas of study than botany. So from a clinical perspective, no, I really don't think you need to know a lot of botany. But herbalism is much greater than just working in the clinic. And I think it really depends on what type of herbalist you want to be. Like there's many different types of herbalists out there, not all of which is inherently focused on the therapeutic side. I mean, I think that's should be the ultimate goal, right? Is that we can help other people with our knowledge of the plants. But there are other areas where I think you really need to know botany, right? And so when do you need to know your botany? Well, I think first and foremost, when it comes to just at the very least getting to know your local plants, you've got to know some botany, right? You got to be able to know how to read a field guide. You've got to be able to know potentially how to use a key. For those of you not familiar, a key is basically a book that is kind of, I don't know how you describe it. But it's basically like you start down, it's like an if-then, if the plant has a yellow flower, go to this step. If it does not, go to that step. And then you answer those questions. If the leaf margins are smooth, go here. If they're serrated, go there. So it's a set of questions that help get you looking at each thing that ultimately narrows it down so that you can key out that herb to its specific species. They can be very tedious. Typically, plant keys are based on certain regions. So like myself, I live in the Pacific Northwest of North America, and we have our flora of the Pacific Northwest, which is the main plant key that we use in this area. So when it comes to getting to know your local remedies, I think the botany is pretty essential. And this ultimately leads to, if you are a wildcrafter, you got to be able to properly identify the plants you're wildcrafting. Now, some herbs are very, very easy to identify. Sometimes someone introduces you to a plant and you're able to look at it, recognize it, understand some of the key identification characteristics, and you can just go and ID that herb without maybe necessarily needing to figure it out on your own by keying it out or looking up descriptions in field guides and things like that. But nonetheless, this is very, very important. And as I mentioned earlier, we have families such as the Apiaceae, which is a vast plant family. And you really need to know how to botanize that family of plant. There have been, people over the years that have misidentified, thought they're digging up a wild carrot, or that they're digging up an OSHA root, and they dug up a poison hemlock root and died, right? So we've got very toxic plants in that family that you got to really know how to differentiate them to make sure that you got the right plants. So when it comes to wildcrafting, I think this is an area where anyone that is seriously wildcrafting really need to know your botany. You need to know your look-alike plants. You need to know key differential characteristics between plants that grow in that similar vicinity. It's just a really important part to just make sure you got the right plant is really what it comes down to. Farming and growing herbs, I think this is a good area to know a little bit of botany too, for similar reasons, right? Sometimes you're buying seeds of plants and growing them. Obviously, you want to be able to trust the seeds that you get, but people make mistakes. And I think it's important if you are growing a particular medicinal that you are able to double check that the plant that is growing, that was put on the label of the seed, is in fact the plant that you are trying to grow. And again, this is what botany ultimately comes down to, is proper identification of plants. This can also apply to obtaining plants from suppliers. Of course, I think the botany part comes a little bit more strongly in fresh herbs. So if you're getting like whole fresh herbs, that's usually a little easier to do. Dried plants, that's a whole other area, oftentimes getting into even microscopic identification and evaluation. Key characteristics that you're looking for in certain dried herbs to make sure, again, that the dried herb that you purchased is the one that you're looking at. Because, as I said earlier, adulteration does happen, sometimes with really drastic adverse effects. One example is Tussilago farfara, or colt's foot. You know, there have been situations where the Western colt's foot was adulterated with butterbur or pedicides, which is an herb that contains some of the more toxic pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Colt's foot in and of itself does have some PAs in it, but smaller amounts of the less toxic ones. Butterbur or pedicides is a little bit more nasty, and there have been cases of people coming to harm from that. So identification is really, really key. And of course, lastly, you need to know botany. You got to know your Latin names of herbs. I'm just going to like hit that nail on the head one more time. Do not just rely on common names of herbs. I think it's very important to learn your Latin names. I know it's hard. I know some of them sound weird and are hard to pronounce. And everybody says, you know, a lot of people pronounce Latin names very differently. Sometimes I even notice like, oh boy, I hear someone say a Latin name different. I'm like, have I been saying it wrong this whole time? Just say it however you say it. But this is a very important piece of botany, is knowing those Latin binomials. Learn your families and what herbs belong to what families can be very, very useful. So in the end, do you need to know botany to be a great herbalist, a great clinical herbalist? No, not really. But I think with these other branches of herbal medicine, I think to be a well-rounded herbalist, you should know a little bit of botany, right? I think as a clinical practitioner, you should be able to recognize the herbs that you're using as a medicine. If you know, it's very common, I think, for a lot of NDs or sometimes clinical herbalists even to give herbs that they've maybe never even seen before. Like their whole relationship to that plant is just like the tincture of it, and they may not even know what it looks like. And I think, and not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think to be a good, well-rounded herbalist, it's nice to be able to recognize the plants, know what they look like, be able to describe them, to just have a better connection with them by knowing, like just knowing what they look like. So, and then, yeah, and especially if you're growing or wildcrafting, this is where I think it really comes into play and being really important, to round out your herbal knowledge. Now, to get more into this, I just wanted to share a couple books that I think are really great and some references here. I think hands down one of the best books on botany that makes it simple, approachable, not quite so overwhelming, is a book called Botany in a Day by Thomas Elpel. This was one of our main textbooks that we used at Bastyr University in my 3 semesters of botany there. It's a really great book. I can't highly recommend it enough. There are also botany glossaries that I think are really useful to have. So if you're reading, you're in a key, and oftentimes there's a bunch of words that you just don't know what they mean. That way you've got a glossary and you can look up some of those important botanical terms like what is a raceme? What does scapos mean? What is the difference between an umbelliferate inflorescence versus another type of inflorescence, etc. For those of you that are west of the Rocky Mountains in the United States or Canada, I really love Michael Moore's books. Michael Moore is a great herbalist, but also a really great botanist. So his books are really good for those west of the Rockies. So he's got Plants of the Pacific West, which is coastal West Coast. You've got Plants of the Mountains West, which really covers west side of the Rockies up to west side of the Cascades. And then you've got the Deserts West, Medicinal Plants of the Pacific West, Medicinal Plants of the Mountains West, Medicinal Plants of the Deserts West. Those are really, really great books because he has good botanical descriptions of the herbs there, along with some really nice drawings and photos too. I highly recommend wherever you live to find the good local plant ID and field guides. I really like the Peterson field guides. I think it's nice to have a variety of field guides though. Some of them are organized differently. For example, some are organized by flower color. Those can be difficult to work with, especially if you're not seeing the plant in flower. I do think it's good to be able to identify a plant at its different stages of growth and development, right? So you can make sure that you can distinguish the mullein leaf from the digitalis leaf, right? To a lot of new eyes to herbs, those can look very, very similar, but to the trained eye, they're notably different. So I encourage you to find what are your regional field guides. And some regional field guides focus on medicinal plants, right? So the Peterson guides have medicinal plant specific, but it's nice to branch out too, right? And there's wildflower field guides, and just nice to have a collection of field guides for your local area. And that way, when you head out into the mountains or into the forest, you've got some stuff to reference to do some botanizing. And also on that note, for those in the United States, the USDA has a list of books that their botanists use. So that can be really useful. Well, I'll drop the URL in the description below that you can just kind of see what the U.S. Department of Agriculture, what their botanists use out in the wild, and if it's good enough for them, it will probably be good enough for us too. And lastly, if you really want to get into it, consider finding a class at a local community college. That's always great because typically those people will have knowledge of the local plants. Oftentimes you'll go out into the field. If you really want to kind of nerd out and get into botany, I think it's really great to take some classes, to find a good botanist to study with that can really show you the ropes. Because it's one of those things that you can learn from a book. It's just way more exciting and enjoyable, I think, to learn this kind of thing from another person that you can ask questions. I think to just strictly learn botany from books, you got to be pretty determined to learn this stuff. But I think for those of you that when you kind of if you start getting in it, you're like, wow, this is really interesting. I'd like to know more. Check out some local courses. The community colleges can be a really great resource for that, to go deeper into that. So that's what I got for you in my answer to the question, do I have to know botany to be a great herbalist? Those are some of my thoughts on the subject. Hopefully you found this illuminating and inspiring and interesting to watch or listen to. And I just want to say thank you for watching this far, listening this far into the video or the podcast. I really appreciate it. It really does help support the channel for you to watch and listen all the way through. If you want to continue to support the channel, hey, just hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. It helps out really maybe more than you know. So thank you very much for that. And of course, if you want to get more free goodness from Evolutionary Herbalism, head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com, where we got lots of other amazing, great, wonderful free resources, free workshop series and training to support the greater herbal community. So thanks so much. I'm Sage Popham. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be with me here. And until the next time, take care and be well.